Albert, who traveled from Missouri to make a series of lectures in New Jersey, and we were lucky to be able to book him for tonight. I again heard his lecture at Brookdale College and immediately booked him for the World War II Book Club. Dr. Ulbrich received his doctorate in history from Temple University in 2007. The Naval Institute Press recently published his first book titled Preparing for Victory, Thomas Holcomb and the Making of the Marine Corps. The book could have been called From Belleau to Guadalcanal because it is a history of what the Marines were doing, particularly during World War II. It's an outstanding book. I urge you to consider purchasing the book at the discounted price of $20. David will sign all copies that are purchased. David has lectured at the National World War II Museum, the Army War College, the Naval War College, Temple University, and Brookdale Community College Center for the Study of World War II. Currently, he's employed as the command historian at the U.S. Army Engineers School at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and is also the senior instructor in master's degrees in military history at the online program at Norwich University. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Ulbrich.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLaughlin. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, good. I want to say how gracious Dr. and Mrs. McLaughlin have been in my stay today and tonight. We had a wonderful dinner together, and they're going to take me to lunch tomorrow, and then he will make sure I get on the airplane at Newark Airport back to Missouri. So I'm very grateful. Thank you. This has been a wonderful visit to the New York, New Jersey area for me. One might wonder why an engineer school historian is doing Marine Corps history, a corps of a different sort. It gets even more interesting, I suppose. I'm actually an oops baby. My father was born, or I was born when my father was 50, and my father was a bombardier with the Army Air Force in World War II. So it's kind of a strange odyssey of someone who was an Air Force brat doing Marine Corps history, now working for the Corps of Engineers. Though I must say, as a trained mechanical engineer, I think my father, if he were alive today, would be pleased that I would be working for the Corps of Engineers. If I was going to do anything for the Army, that would be something that he would appreciate. Anyway, all right. Before you saw the title or even thought about this topic, could I see a show of hands? How many of you had heard of Thomas Holcomb? All right, just one. That's pretty typical. I would argue that Thomas Holcomb is one of those unsung heroes of the World War II era. And I picked this photograph here because it's the most boring photograph, the most boring black and white photograph I could find of Commandant Holcomb, General Holcomb. He did not cut the great physique, the great sort of picture of say, Chesty Puller with that sort of grim smirk on his face. He did not have a exciting nickname like Howling Mad or Red Mike. He did not grasp the media coverage that Evans Carlson did. Instead, I would argue that Thomas Holcomb was much like Dwight D. Eisenhower, George Marshall, and Chester Nimitz in that he worked behind the scenes, not pushing himself, not grabbing the glory and the spotlight, but worked behind the scenes to manage the war effort. In this case, he worked from Washington, D.C. at headquarters Marine Corps. He had a very long career. This is a photograph probably of his commissioning in 1900. I don't have confirmation of that, but judging by the buttons and so on and the uniforms, this was probably his commissioning photo. you can see as a young man, then 21 years old, he definitely had still the baby face, the boyish good looks. In fact, he tried to join the Marine Corps in 1898 as an officer. He was then about 5'3" and maybe a buck and a quarter. And when he walked up to the Marine recruiting officer, the Marine recruiting sergeant in Washington, D.C., and tried to join, the recruiting sergeant said, "Son, you can't join the Marine Corps. You couldn't stand the gaff," which in 1898 language means you couldn't stand the physical stress, the mental stress, and all the activities that Marines did. Well, the disappointed Thomas Holcomb took the next 2 years to study for an exam to become an officer through examination. He also worked as an accounts clerk in a steel yard, or rather a shipyard in Baltimore Harbor for the next 2 years. Then in 1900, he was able to pass an exam and enter the United States Marine Corps. Now, when he entered in 1900, he had grown 3 or 4 inches. Now, that's a pretty good growth spurt to grow from 5'3" to 5'7" between your 18th and 20th birthdays. It is rumored, though I have never been able to conclusively find the evidence, it's rumored that he had himself stretched, which would have been a very painful experience back then. I can only imagine it. He must have really wanted to be a Marine. Well, he did finally join the Marine Corps and spent the next 43 years serving the Corps in the United States of America. Throughout the first 20 or 30 years of his career, he was known for 3 things in the United States Marine Corps. Number 1, he was known as a marksman. He had never competed or even shot weapons, shot rifles or pistols as a civilian. But when he got into the Marine Corps, the drill instructors and so on realized that he was a crack shot. So he embraced marksmanship. Indeed, he competed and later commanded the Marine Corps rifle team to several world championships and national championships. This photograph you see here is from 1910 in Peking, China. Thomas Holcomb is standing on the left with a mustache and a cigar. And if you look very carefully, I don't know if the pixels are there, but I can tell you right now, the Americans won the international matches, defeating the Germans and the Austrians and the British and the French. It is arguable that it was because Holcomb's emphasis, his personal experience and his own career emphasis on marksmanship, that today every Marine is a rifleman. You can track that concept of every Marine being first and foremost a rifleman back to the early 1900s and Thomas Holcomb. Throughout his entire career, he emphasized that Marines should have that skill set, no matter what their MOS was, no matter what their role in the military was. He was also well known for his experience and exploits in the First World War. In 1914, World War I started in Europe, and Thomas Holcomb was in 1914 a major, then stationed at Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington, D.C., where he was working on an ad hoc war plans division, or an ad hoc war plans committee, I should say. 3 committee members. One of the other members was Pete Ellis, a very well-known Marine who helped to place the Marine Corps as a very prominent part in War Plan Orange, the plan to defeat Japan. Well, he and Ellis worked directly for then Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, John Lejeune. When World War I started in 1914, the Marines began to make plans to figure out a way to participate in that war should the United States become involved. In 1917, in April, the United States entered World War I, and 1 brigade of Marines, approximately 9,000 Marines, shipped over to Europe to fight the Germans. Now, this is a tiny number, 9,000. There were at most, I think, 50 or 60 American divisions, each one with 2 brigades. That's 120 brigades of soldiers, Army soldiers in World War I, and just 1 brigade of Marines. If you read the news, you'd think it was all Marines, because the Marines, even in World War I, were able to grab the headlines. Well, anyway, Holcomb lived up to those headlines. He was commanding the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment at Belleau Wood. there, just actually south of Belleau Wood. He was in the famed wheat field, marching across the field with approximately 500 Marines through the wheat, and his unit suffered 50% casualties in that attack in June 1918. The wheat field is one of those iconic experiences for Marines that ranks behind Iwo Jima, Khe Sanh, Tarawa, but it's up there in the probably top 5 iconic experiences. He was there. He did capture the village of Buresh. I think that's how it's pronounced. I studied German in graduate school, which ruined my ability to speak the pretty languages, so I can't really speak French very well, but I'm just blaming that on studying German. Anyway, he captured this village, and then it was repeatedly attacked by overwhelming German forces for the next 6 days. He maintained security of that village. He held that village against those attacks. I should add that he was reinforced. I must give some love to my current employer, the U.S. Army Engineer School, because 175 engineer soldiers reinforced Thomas Holcomb's Marines and helped to fortify and secure that village. That experience on Belleau Wood earned Holcomb the first of 2 Croix de Guerre. The Croix de Guerre is essentially the French version of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And this is the citation. Commanding a battalion and a regiment of Marines on a front which was being violently attacked, thanks to his untiring energy, the exactness of his judgments, and his tactical knowledge, Holcomb maintained his battalion on this line, later taking the village of Buresh and repulsing a number of enemy counterattacks. If you add up all the decorations that Thomas Holcomb received, and he did not receive the Medal of Honor, but he received at least one of every other decoration available. Thomas Holcomb ranks in the top 10 most decorated Marines of the First World War. After the experience at Belleau Wood in June of 1918, he goes on to be promoted to lieutenant colonel and became assistant regimental commander, yet he still returned to the front at later battles in the Meuse-Argonne campaign to see what was happening. He believed in being at the front and seeing what his Marines were going through so he could report back to the senior staff. He was also awarded the Purple Heart because at one point he was the victim of a gas attack by the Germans. So that's the second experience. The third thing that he was known for, the third topic he was known for, was China. Between 1900 and 1930, Thomas Holcomb spent 13 years on station deployed to China. Most of that time was in Peking, including a 6-year stint, a renewed tour. Now, back in the early 1900s, China was the plum deployment for Marines, because even a private in the U.S. Marine Corps at that time, stationed in China, had enough money to have servants. So if you were an officer in China, you were treated like royalty. There was great food, great social events, horse racing, and hunting, for example. Thomas Holcomb put his his rifle skills, his marksmanship skills into practice as a hunter. Of course, when he dressed up in civilian clothes, like this photograph, and went on a hunting trip, he was also gathering intelligence on Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek to report back to Washington, D.C. Apart from those experiences with those leaders, Holcomb also interacted with some Japanese leaders that happened to be coming and going in China at the time. He learned the Chinese language. In fact, in my book, I found an actual examination that Thomas Holcomb took in written Chinese, and I have the comments from his instructor that said he could read and speak actually like a native. So he took the time not just to sightsee, but also to embrace and understand Chinese culture and language. As I said, he spent 13 years there. One place he did not get deployed, though, was Latin America. Many Marines, many thousands of Marines were deployed to Latin America between 1900 and 1935. In fact, in the 1920s, there were as many as 4,000 Marines deployed to places like Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, or the Dominican Republic at one time. That's a big chunk of Marines because there were less than 20,000 Marines total. Holcomb never went to Latin America, although that did not hurt him in his career overall, because he was a member of the 2nd Division Mafia, you might call it that. The U.S. Army 2nd Division included the Marine Brigade, so he had that going for him, the combat experience in World War I. He was also an old China hand, which put him into a particular group, or dare I say clique of Marines, that allowed him to advance in rank. Throughout his career, Holcomb had an uncanny ability to be at the right place, at the right time, with the right skill set and the right contacts. He was able to acquire mentors and role models, such as John Lejeune, that looked after him and helped propel his career. Now, don't get me wrong, he did not ingratiate himself, he did not kiss up to other Marines or other officers. He was the consummate professional. One of the things I always tell the engineer soldiers and NCOs and officers that I teach at Fort Leonard Wood, I always tell them, never underestimate a good reputation. It's hard to develop a good reputation, and it's easy to ruin it. And once you ruin that good reputation among your peers, and this just isn't in the Army and the Marine Corps, this could be in business, this could be in other areas of life. Once you ruin that reputation, it's very hard to repair it. It's even harder to repair it than to establish it in the first place. Holcomb never ruined his good reputation. And he could back it up because he not only talked the talk, he could also walk the walk. 1930, he returned to the United States from China for the last time. And in the next 2 years, in 1930 to 32, he did back-to-back year-long studies at the Naval War College and at the Army War College. He had never gone to college as an undergraduate himself, but he's still a self-made student, a very well-read Marine. In these 2 years at the war colleges, he got a chance to study the level of war that he had not yet experienced. He studied diplomacy and logistics and strategy, and was able to apply much of his knowledge at the lower levels of rank and warfare, apply it in a theoretical base at the highest levels. He did war games. He was involved in war games in which the United States took on Japan and Germany, and basically kind of stimulated those conflicts. He also had some very interesting classmates. At the Army War College, where he was a colonel, which was actually kind of rare to have a colonel go to the Army War College at that time, a full colonel, he had a classmate, a major by the name of then Major, George S. Patton Jr. So we got to rub elbows with some very influential people that he would later on interact with in World War II. Following the stint at the war colleges, he served as an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, the senior admiral in Washington, D.C., from 1932 to 1935. He advised the Chief of Naval Operations on amphibious warfare and war planning. Then he became Commandant of the Marine Corps schools at Quantico. And this is where he was able to take all the book learning and all the street smarts that he developed earlier in his career and help educate for future Marine officers. During his time, the Marines at Quantico, the Marine students at Quantico, finished up the Small Wars Manual, which would later become the sort of precursor to David Petraeus, Lieutenant General David Petraeus and Lieutenant General John Amos's most recent counterinsurgency manual written in 2006-2007. They cribbed a lot of their notes from the Small Wars Manual of the 1930s written by the Marines. He also helped to finish up the Tentative Manual for Defense of Advanced Bases. This was the Bible on how to defend islands like Wake Island and Guam in the middle of the Pacific. So you can see that throughout his career, he had the combination of experience on the battlefield and the right connections, and then the right academic accomplishments, and the right experience as a trainer of officers. So we get up to 1936. Thomas Holcomb's a one-star general in 1936. He is the most junior general in the U.S. Marine Corps. At that time, there were only 8 general officers in the United States Marine Corps. 3 two-star generals, and the rest were one-star generals. In 1936, Holcomb leapfrogged those other 7 generals to be promoted to become commandant. Now, one of the questions I get is why? Well, in many cases, he had established himself as a competent leader, but he also did not have any weaknesses. He did not have any shortcomings. He did not have any failures. He was just the right age. He had had the right experiences in China in World War I. So if you add up his collective strengths, they outweighed the other competitors' collective weaknesses. The other thing is, he had developed a personal relationship with one Franklin Delano Roosevelt, going all the way back to World War I. When he was working for the Marine War Planning Committee, Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They became friends, and they maintained that friendship. Along came 1933, Franklin Roosevelt becomes President of the United States. And Franklin Roosevelt had an uncanny ability to appoint the right person for the right role. Across the board, I think Roosevelt chose excellent leaders for the armed services. There's another personal connection. Thomas Holcomb's only son was born in 1917. He's a teenager by the 1930s. When he's about 15 years old, his son, Franklin, got sick with a really bad fever. It left him bedridden for 6 or 8 months, which meant his muscles had atrophied. His medical doctor told Commandant Holcomb that, your son needs to go swimming. That's the way that he can rebuild his muscles. And Washington, D.C. was not the beltway that we know today. Washington, D.C. in the 1930s was still essentially a southern town. There was only one swimming pool in Washington, D.C., and that was at the White House. Well, Holcomb was friends with President Roosevelt, so I've seen documents that say that Holcomb would get into his convertible Chevy, drive from his the commandant's house, drop by the White House, drop off his son to go swimming, and then drive to work and pick his son up after lunch. So again, these are some of the personal relationships that Holcomb had developed earlier in his life, and then he leveraged later. Again, he was not one to abuse those personal relationships, but when he needed them, for example, when his son needed to go swimming, he would certainly utilize them. Holcomb was a leader and a manager. He understood that there should be some relationship between a good leader and a good manager. So a manager would fit into some sort of flow chart, some sort of organizational chart. But for Holcomb, a good leader would have a certain, called God-given talent for leadership. And this quote talks about this. Writing in 1943, looking back on his career, Holcomb wrote Holcomb was convinced rather, that even if it has an ideal chart, any large organization to be successful must be headed by a personality, one possessed of those qualities of leadership which command respect and loyalty, and which inspires all hands the determination, the compelling desire to work together for a common end. And no graph or chart, no rules or regulations or other printed works can replace such leadership. This is another thing I always tell the officers that I speak to. You can have the best flow chart, the best structure, the best function, but if you don't have the personality there, the right leader to manage that, or the right leader to lead those people, then even the best organization can fall on its face. And he certainly worked very hard to live by these ideas throughout his career. Here's a couple of great photographs that I stumbled onto. My dissertation was done in 2007 at Temple University, and about that same time, Holcomb's granddaughters and his recently deceased daughter-in-law, Thomas Holcomb himself had died in 1965. Back in 2007, 2008, they donated, his daughter-in-law and his granddaughters donated several thousand new photographs, or photographs newly donated, and several thousand more pages of his personal papers to the Marine Corps Archives at Quantico. Now they donated those about the same time I finished my dissertation, and the archivist at Quantico purposely didn't tell me, because he knew if he told me, I would never get my dissertation done. My head would spin around like The Exorcist, and I'd have to go look at the stuff. So he purposely waited until my dissertation was done and told me after the fact, which was just as well, because that meant when I transitioned my dissertation into the book, I had something to add. Well, these are some of the photographs. Let's see if I can get the little pointer to work. That is Major General Howling Mad Smith of the Marines. There's Thomas Holcomb next in line. Next in line, you can see the fellow with the binoculars. That's Secretary of the Navy Franklin Knox. And this soldier, in a slightly different colored uniform, pointing to these soldiers and Marines landing, is then Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander, 1st Infantry Division. These photographs were taken in July 1941 in North Carolina on the coast, where the 1st Marine Division and the 1st Infantry Division of the U.S. Army were conducting joint exercises. And the photographer took this photograph and literally turned around and took the photograph of either soldiers or Marines disembarking from a Higgins boat. Note that that Higgins boat did not yet have the floppy bow ramp, the bow ramp that the Higgins boats would adopt later on in the war. These sorts of photographs are what historians and these types of archival finds, or what, as a historian and other historians I know, there's several who've written books in the audience and articles. These are what we live for. These are the smoking guns. These are the ones that, you know, give us a tingly feeling inside. I know that may sound kind of, you know, nerdy or geekish, but, you know, it makes us all very happy when we find these sorts of things. Some of these photographs are in my book. Again, Holcomb himself became an amateur photographer later in life. When he stopped competitive shooting, he became a photographer. And I believe there's a correlation. If you're shooting a target at 600 or 800 yards, you've got to be very patient. You've got to allow for windage and elevation. You've got to guesstimate the range. You've got to, you've got to test for the wind and so on. You've got to be very patient. You've got to hold your breath as you squeeze the trigger. Those same sorts of skill sets would be applied to photography. The same sort of things if you're taking that excellent photographic picture. You've got to wait for the right lighting. You've got to wait for the right time. You've got to be patient. And you've got to recognize a good picture when you see it and snap that picture. The skill sets were similar. So again, I think this also goes to Holcomb's temperament. He was calm. He was quiet. He was very patient, yet could be very decisive. He could take that shot, whether it was on the rifle range or with his camera. Pearl Harbor occurs December 7th, 1941, and based on my understanding of Holcomb's sort of weekly regimen, he would have gone to church with his wife at an Episcopal church in Washington, D.C. that morning, Sunday, December 7th, and he would have come home and been eating lunch when suddenly the radio would have started blaring and the phones would have started ringing, and about 1:30 in the afternoon, Washington time, he made his way into naval headquarters to start dealing with this attack on Pearl Harbor. Throughout this process, a description of naval headquarters was it was like an anthill that got kicked the top off of an anthill with all these sailors and Marines running around hysterically trying to find out what to do. Holcomb was very calm. He was sort of the anchor in that storm. He never became upset, never lost his temper, never showed any level of visible stress. So then we come to Guadalcanal, August 1942. This is just a few months after Pearl Harbor, and Guadalcanal is the first counteroffensive for the United States against the Japanese. Coral Sea and Midway were great naval victories. Those stopped the Japanese advance, and Guadalcanal was the first counteroffensive. Holcomb worked very closely with Major General Alexander Vandergrift, then commander of the 1st Marine Division that landed on Guadalcanal. Some 7,000 Marines landed on Tulagi, Gavato, and Tanabago to the north, and the remaining 11,000 Marines landed on the northern shore of Guadalcanal. Their goal was to capture the airfield on Guadalcanal that the Japanese had been constructing. This is a map that I have drawn up for my book. This happened on August 7th, 1942. 4 days later, Vandegrift wrote a report to send back to his good friend Thomas Holcomb, a handwritten and typed report. Along with this report, there were a couple of hand-drawn maps. That is a map of Tulagi, giving the sort of where the Marines landed and where the defenses were. And that's a hand-drawn map of the northern coast of Guadalcanal. And you'll note, you can see the airfield here, you can see the Tonaroo River, Alligator Creek, you can see this grassy knob to the south, which would be the site of the Battle of Edson's Ridge a couple months later. These were hand-drawn maps that were sent back to Thomas Holcomb at Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. Again, these were some of the documents that the family donated after my dissertation was done. And these, again, are these are amazing finds for a historian. No one had ever seen these complete reports. There had been excerpts that had been written from these reports, but no one had seen the entire reports until the family donated them, and I read them. There's the main defensive area. Now, Thomas Holcomb kept in direct contact with Alexander Vandegrift, who was the first commander of the 1st Marine Division there on Guadalcanal. And here are some of the photographs from Thomas Holcomb's own collection. You see a Marine there in a bunker, and the photograph on the right, I believe, is Edson's Ridge. And here's another hand-drawn map that would have been sent to Thomas Holcomb later on in September. Again, the Marines were so hard to put on Guadalcanal that they didn't even have much more than paper with hand-drawn maps to write back to headquarters. There was the major battle at Tonaroo River or Alligator Creek in August 20th, 1942. Then you have the Battle of Edson's Ridge in mid-September, and ongoing attacks by the Japanese against the western part of the Marine perimeter at Guadalcanal. The goal for the Marines were to protect the airfield, the all-important airfield, from which Marine and naval pilots were defending the island and also attacking Japanese forces in the area. And over these months, the issue was still in doubt, even in October, but the Marines were holding their own. In October, Thomas Holcomb made one of his greatest contributions to the war effort by traveling to Guadalcanal. This is a long trip in October. It was about a 5-week junket traveling 25,000 miles from Washington, D.C. down to Guadalcanal, which is right down near Australia, really, and back. He did this for several reasons. Number one, President Roosevelt wanted him to go to Guadalcanal to see for himself so Holcomb could report back to President Roosevelt what was happening. Roosevelt also wanted Holcomb to see what was happening in Guadalcanal to inspire the troops. Roosevelt also wanted Thomas Holcomb to come back and tell the American people what was really happening at Guadalcanal. Because when we think of battles, we think of maybe 20 minutes at the Battle of Midway, where the entire war is changed in 20 minutes. Maybe we think of 3 days at Gettysburg. But the battle for Guadalcanal lasted 6 months. That's a long time for the American public's attention span to keep interested. So these were all important reasons for Holcomb to go to Guadalcanal. Here he is on the right talking with Colonel Red Mike Edson of the Raider Battalion and Vandegrift. And this is one of my favorite photographs that came out of the collection that was donated. That is Thomas Holcomb sitting in a dinghy, Major General, or actually at that point Lieutenant General in Commandant of the Marine Corps, and this is Major General Vandegrift attempting to balance his way and get on the dinghy. That is some magnificently awesome transportation for a service chief, don't you think? And of course, this would have been in Alligator Creek or someplace like that, and so they didn't call it Alligator Creek for nothing. There's probably alligators and crocodiles and all sorts of other, unpleasant animals in the water too. So he doesn't want to fall in. And then we have Thomas Holcomb riding in a Jeep around Guadalcanal. Thomas Holcomb's other, and I know this is a very busy slide, but I'll break it down for you. Thomas Holcomb also wanted to restructure the command relationship to help the Marines better fight future amphibious assaults. This was the original command structure before Guadalcanal. Here we have the Marine Corps, or Army commander, who's the commander of the landing force. And he has 3 Navy commanders that can give him orders. And the naval commander could even influence how the Marine or Army commander fought the ground operations. Once the beachhead is established, once the Marines are fighting inland, the naval admiral in charge could tell the Marine commander how to fight. This was not working well. So while he was in Guadalcanal, Holcomb helped to reform the situation. He worked with Alexander Vandergrift and with William Bowles Halsey to create this command relationship, where the Marine commander would be equal, co-equal with the Navy commander in the planning stage and the ground operations stage. That would allow the Marine commander to fight the battle the way he wanted to once he was on the ground. This relationship is a precursor to today's Marine Corps Air Ground Task Force, the Marine Air Ground Task Force, MAGTAF, which is one of the most important Marine force structures in the Cold War and since the Cold War. Well, how did he do this? He met with Alexander Vandergrift and William Halsey, Admiral William Halsey, off Guadalcanal, actually on a little island called Noumea nearby. And they crafted this new change of command structure. And they knew they had to sell it to Nimitz, Chester Nimitz, and to Admiral King. So what happens is this. Holcomb agrees with Halsey what should happen. Halsey sends 2 telegrams to Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. And Nimitz and these telegrams say, all right, this is going to be the new command structure. The Marines are going to have some autonomy. The next telegram going up says, wait for Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb to arrive in Pearl Harbor to confirm. So by the time Holcomb gets to Pearl Harbor 2 weeks later, he walks in and says, Admiral Nimitz, I got an idea on command structure. And Nimitz says, got it, already read it, I agree totally. So then Nimitz turns and sends telegrams to Ernest King back in Washington, D.C., basically laying the groundwork for this change in policy, this change in doctrine, this change in command structure. And so by the time Holcomb gets back to Washington, D.C., 2 weeks later, he goes into Admiral King and says, Admiral King, sir, I have an idea about Marine Corps command structure and amphibious operations. And King says, I got it, I agree. It's already going to be policy. Now, this is very fast moving, even in wartime, to change a major command structure. It's actually an amazing feat. And I had read some other books that talked about it in like 1 paragraph. I had read some oral history interviews that talked about it. I was at the National Archives, and I actually found the telegrams that Halsey sent to Nimitz justifying what should happen. And that was enough to prove the entire story in my mind. Holcomb does this in shepherding and basically ghostwriting and shepherding this major change in policy. Now you may think, well, what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal because without this change of policy, once the Americans landed at D-Day in Normandy, the naval commander could technically control the race across France when it should be Bradley, it should be Montgomery, it should be Patton. It shouldn't be a naval commander telling those generals how to fight the war. So this becomes policy and is applied throughout the rest of the conflict. Now, I've painted Thomas Holcomb in, I think, very flattering brushstrokes here. I think he was an effective leader, he was an outstanding Marine, but he was not a social progressive. He was forced by Franklin Roosevelt to accept Marines, or accept African Americans into the Marine Corps. He bitterly resisted. In fact, if you put them on a spectrum, on the far side of being sort of, in our terms, bigoted and racist in 21st century vocabulary, Thomas Holcomb and Ernest King were racists. A little bit more towards the middle, a little more tolerant, were George Marshall and Hap Arnold, but still not completely open to full integration. But they were more tolerant than Holcomb and King. Now, the easy way to interpret this is to say Holcomb was just a product of his environment and move on. And he was a product of his environment to some degree. This was the 1930s, this was the 1940s, you had segregation, you had separate but equal, which actually meant separate but unequal. I tried to dig a little bit further. And what I found is that Holcomb had not interacted with African Americans in any significant way. He didn't know any African Americans really, and so therefore he was prejudiced. He prejudged African Americans based on what society and what he had said and what he thought they were all about. Holcomb changes his tune, in my opinion. After he retires in December 1943, he retires from being Commandant of the Marine Corps, he becomes ambassador to South Africa from 1944 to 1948. And there he sees the real vicious face of racism. He went there to try to help renegotiate Lend-Lease agreements with South Africa, some other sort of diplomatic maneuvering. And while there, he saw the white minority government of South Africa put the boot to the black majority. In 1946, there was a big strike by gold miners in South Africa. Obviously, they were the black minority. I think 60,000 went on strike, and the white South African government sent the South African army in to put down the strike. They killed or wounded about 3,000 of the miners and sent the rest of them, licking their wounds, back to the gold mines. Holcomb watches this, and I have the actual letters that he sent back to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C., from Pretoria or Cape Town, back or Johannesburg, wherever it was, back to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. And I quote, Holcomb said, and I quote, "These people are living in the dark, not the blacks, the whites. They are centripetal in attitude, they are oppressive, and they are undemocratic." Now, someone who was a true racist through and through wouldn't say that at all about that treatment. It's my argument that Holcomb moderated his views on race because of his experience in South Africa. He got to see the darkest side, the worst side, the most vicious side of racism in South Africa. And I must say this, Holcomb never would have condoned anything such as lynching in the South. He would have condemned those kind of unlawful acts of terrorism. I believe that Holcomb was, candidly a Plessy v. Ferguson racist, for lack of a better term. He believed in separate but equal. He believed in segregation. Of course, as we know, separate was not equal. The schools and the other facilities that African Americans had in society at the time were inferior to those enjoyed by most whites. I do believe, though, after South Africa, he did redeem his views to some degree. This is what Admiral King said about Holcomb's leadership, his accomplishments as a Marine Corps Commandant. And if you know anything about Ernest King, quite frankly, I'll just say it this way. Ernest King was a son of a bitch. He was just a mean guy. He did not pass out compliments. He did not give compliments easily. This is what he said about Holcomb's command of the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps successfully met the greatest test in its history by forging a huge mass of untrained officers and men into an efficient tactical units, especially organized, equipped, and trained for the complicated amphibious operations which characterized the war in the Pacific. Again, getting praise from Ernest King in writing, that's pretty impressive because Ernest King did not give out praise easily. Therefore, I firmly believe that Commandant Thomas Holcomb deserves to be in the same stratosphere of wartime leaders as George Marshall, as Dwight Eisenhower, and as Chester Nimitz. They all shared a similar temperament, calmness under fire, ability to manage incredible numbers of men, incredible amounts of resources over tens of thousands of miles. They also shared a humility. None of these men grabbed the spotlight intentionally. Thomas Holcomb never had 200 or 300 cameramen following him like Douglas MacArthur did, or like George S. Patton did. He never had that. He was always behind the scenes trying to manage the war effort. Yes, he would gain publicity, he would take advantage of publicity, it would help his corps and the war effort, but not for his own personal glory. And if you know anything about Chester Nimitz, for example, Chester Nimitz was a very humble, unassuming leader, yet one of the great war managers of World War II, and it can be argued that Eisenhower and Marshall fell into the same mold. So with that, I thank you for your attendance, and I will certainly entertain questions.
Please wait until Tommy Schwartz arrives with the microphone so everybody can hear the question. Yeah.
Why was he released from command of the Marine Corps in 1943 during the middle of the war?
That's a good question. There's several answers to that. First of all, he took over in 1936, so he had been Commandant of the Marine Corps for 7 years. That's a long time. Now, Marshall took over in 39. So Marshall took over in 39. So Holcomb took over in 1936 when the size of the Marine Corps was 18,000 officers and men, smaller than the New York City Police Department, and $20 million budget. When he left in 1943, it was 385,000 Marines and a $600 million budget. In his own words, he was tired. Now, of course, Franklin Roosevelt could have overruled that and kept him on. Admiral Leahy was overage, Douglas MacArthur was overage, so he could have kept on. I think another important reason was that Holcomb had been grooming Alexander Vandergrift to be his successor. Alexander Vandergrift was at Guadalcanal. He had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was an effective leader, so Holcomb tried to push Vandergrift forward, and Vandergrift, of course, took the Marines through the rest of the war, through Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and so on, and on to victory. And then Vandergrift stayed on as commandant until 1947 and defended the Marine Corps through the unification crisis. But bottom line, 2 reasons: Holcomb was tired, and he had a good replacement. If you look at his career from 1936 to 43, there were 2 Army Chiefs of Staff, Malin Craig from 36 to 39, and then George Marshall from 39 to 45. There were 4 Chiefs of Naval Operations during those 7 years. So again, Holcomb was tired, he had put in his time, and he had also enforced mandatory retirement at age 64 of all of the Marines, so he wanted to practice what he preached. Any other questions?
Well, based on what you're saying.
Got this one.
Yeah, Hap Arnold was the head of the Army Air Forces. He had four heart attacks, and he still went. I think he ought to be up there if this guy's up there, in terms of what air power did to win that war is pretty significant. And the way he went about it, if you look at his history, and also the way that he handled the troops coming home, I don't think anyone had a redistribution program like him. So I think a case could be made more for Hap Arnold than this guy. That would just be my opinion.
Well, I could put a number of people. Wiedemeyer, I could put, Brigham Somerville should be up there. Brigham Somerville, Lieutenant General and the commander of the Army Service Forces, commanded 2 million logistics soldiers during World War II and managed the supply line. So yes, you could. The reason why I made this point is that he was a service chief, as was Hap Arnold, but I don't know. Yeah, Hap Arnold could go up there. I mean, they could go up. People that can't go up there are Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, and Evans Carlson and Howling Matt Smith. Those sort of glory hounds should not go up there. But yeah, Hap Arnold can do that. And Hap Arnold did, although Hap Arnold did enjoy having a vote on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which guaranteed him more resources and more say in the war effort than Thomas Holcomb did. Thomas Holcomb had to sell whatever he wanted to do through Ernest King, which again was not the easiest thing to do. So, but Hap Arnold, yes, definitely. Hap Arnold should be up there, but I guess there's not enough room to put big enough paintings up there for all of them.
One thing I'd like you to comment on, Nimitz seem to think that we shouldn't attack the Philippines, we should actually starve them out. And MacArthur had to get back. How do you interpret that?
MacArthur in the Philippines. MacArthur was, how do I put it nicely? MacArthur was a force of nature, and MacArthur had a very good lobby. MacArthur was not going to be denied. It is arguable that the United States Navy could have blockaded the Philippines, cut off the supply line from Southeast Asia with all the oil, tin, and rubber up to Japan, and Nimitz wanted to go to Formosa, or modern-day Taiwan, and use that as the jumping-off point. I believe that MacArthur was not going to be denied. He was, according to Franklin Roosevelt, MacArthur was one of the two most dangerous men in America, the other being Huey Long. And so, Huey Long, of course, was assassinated in, 36? But MacArthur simply was not going to be denied. Almost, if it wouldn't have been for the tin can sailors of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, MacArthur probably wouldn't have done as well as he might have at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, those little destroyers that stopped the Japanese fleet. I can say more about MacArthur. I was once, when I was a young child, I was enamored with the MacArthur sort of mystique, but I have become less enamored with MacArthur as the years have gone by. But that's another story. I just think MacArthur was not going to be denied, no matter what Nimitz or Leahy or King or even Roosevelt himself said. Of course, the other thing about, by 1944, I think Roosevelt was more sickly. He was ill by 1944, so I don't know that Roosevelt had the cantankerousness to deal with some of the pressures by 1944, as opposed to the Roosevelt of 1936 or 1940. So I think it was also maybe a health thing on Roosevelt's part. That he just, he was dying by then, really. Other questions? A question up front here. I'm counting to 10. For me, it's 10 long seconds that last an eternity. For you, it's just 10 seconds. So, yes. Yes, sir.
Was it unusual for a person to achieve the rank Holcomb achieved without having had any really formal education during his career?
Yes, in some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. If you look at the commandants of the Marine Corps, beginning with Lejeune all the way up through Vandegrift, so that's Lejeune, Miller, one other, Hebard, Russell, then Holcomb, then Vandegrift. Holcomb was the only one without a college education. Lejeune, or Lejeune, but now the family wants you to call him Lejeune, went to the Naval Academy. Vandegrift went to University of Virginia. Russell went to University of Pennsylvania. Holcomb did not. Now, one of the things you've got to understand about when Holcomb was was a teenager, maybe going to college. Only 2% of the entire population, the male population in the United States, went to college in the 1890s. Only 2%. And that was the elite, the wealthiest of the wealthy. Now, there were, of course, the academies. Holcomb wanted to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. However, in the 1890s, his parents endured the recession of the 1890s, which meant they lost a lot of money. So he dutifully stepped aside from going to the academy himself to help his family survive that depression, so his younger brother could go to the Naval Academy before. He was a self-made man. I would argue, though, that by being an accounts clerk at a major shipyard in Baltimore Harbor, he learned the inner workings of industry and how complex operations function, how inventories work, how payrolls work, and all that sort of thing. He got hands-on training as an apprentice that I would think would have been at least as valuable as book learning in college. That's how middle-class men became middle-class men in the 1890s. They were apprentices as attorneys or as accountants or managers or whatever else. There was an apprenticeship. So he was rare. He was rare for the Marine Corps commandants, and he was rare for the other service chiefs, but not rare within American society as a whole for his generation. Another question up here.
Here, huh?
Watch your step there.
I kind of fool around with genealogy, and I've had a family picture of my father's cousins, and one of them was, this is World War I, he had a 2nd Infantry Division patch on, which I recognized and such. I had an opportunity to meet his son, who was my second cousin, and I never knew him before, but I met him last summer. And he tells me he was really a Marine gunner, a machine gunner, and had received some honors during that period. Now, can I assume that he was attached to the 2nd Infantry, the way you described it before?
Definitely. The only Marines that fought in World War I was the Marine Brigade. I can't remember if it was the 4th or 5th Brigade, whichever it was. It was a Marine Brigade of 9,000 Marines that made up half the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division. It had the Indian head patch.
Right.
Those were the only Marines that would have fought. So yes, if he was a Marine fighting in World War I, he would have been a member of that Marine Brigade. And then there were, several battalions and 2 regiments and so on.
Are there some good sources to read about in terms of that campaign? And that's Bella Woods you were...
Yes. Actually, there is a superb book written by a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel named Peter Owen, and it's titled "To the Limits of Their Endurance, a Marine Battalion in World War I." To the limits of their endurance. That's an entire book on actually Holcomb's battalion, but it covers all the Marines in World War I, and it's a very sort of tactical and operational, day by day, battle by battle, blow by blow study of Holcomb's battalion. And I drew a lot of my information on Holcomb from Peter Owen's book. There's also several books that were written in the 1920s. When many of these veterans came back, they had free time, they had some money, and they donated money to have books written. And so the 2nd Infantry Division has its own history of World War I. And then there's also the American Battles and Monuments Commission that had several books written on all the divisions in World War I. But,
Thank you very much.